Well, Afghan troops defeated by the Taliban weren't just trained by the West, they were armed by us too. That means the Taliban have now acquired, amongst other things, 100,000 M16 rifles and 7,000 Humvees. However, it's not weapons, but people that are the Taliban's most deadly resource. In the run-up to 9/11, they created a safe space for terrorists from other countries, and 20,000 passed through al-Qaeda's training camps, including, as we've mentioned already, Osama bin Laden. Will that happen again in Afghanistan? And what about here in the UK? Away from the mainstream mosques in radical circles, how many hardline Islamists are celebrating today? How many have been re-energised by events 5,000 miles away? There is another side to Afghanistan's human story. Will it lead to an upsurge in domestic terror here? Well, let's turn to Nick Aldworth, a former national coordinator in counter-terrorism policing. Nick, thanks for your time today. Will it become a playground for terrorists again, Afghanistan?
So, Colin, that's a really difficult question to answer. I think that the real risk there is in the medium to long term. And when you look at the most active caliphate of recent times, that's obviously the Islamic State and in Iraq and the Levant. That happened because of ungoverned space. Effectively, we had a collapsed government in Iraq and collapsing in Syria. And we had these great expanses of land where people could set up their own cities, take over existing cities, set up their own ideology, set up their own state. And it's from those sorts of places that the toxic ideology starts to be espoused and create safe havens for people to either go and join and train or just to operate from and project propaganda. Now, I think the way things are unfolding at the moment in Afghanistan, we're not in that place. But as your previous contributors mentioned, Afghanistan is a very tribal country, and the Taliban per se are split among many different factions that have come together over time to create the entity that they are today. I think the real threat there of ungoverned space is probably a medium to long-term threat. And that's something that I'd be expecting the secret intelligence services of the UK and others to be actively monitoring and seeking to interject our presence there to try and actually stop that from happening.
You make a very important distinction between Islamic State, where the people who went there, and they went there from elsewhere, some of them, a great many of them, but they went there with ideology of forethought, whereas there are members of the Taliban, we don't know what proportion, for whom what's happened is simply a liberation struggle. It's about throwing off the imperial yoke. So their motivation, in the short term at least, is going to be different.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Colin. I think the really important message here is don't conflate the issue of terrorism with the issue of the Taliban. They are distinct things. I'm sure there are terrorists within the Taliban entity, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're talking about people who have taken over a country and potentially are going to create a state which is oppressive and awful for the people that actually live in that country, but potentially, as we saw 20 years ago, are going to create a safe space for other terrorist organisations to operate. I think our greatest risk in the short term is that the feeble-minded that are already in the UK and have a propensity towards thinking about radical Islam and wanting to use violence to project, quite frankly, an ideology that many of them don't even understand, may feel emboldened by what they're seeing. The fact that they have this sort of mindset already definitely means they don't have the intellectual capacity to have the sort of debate that you're having on your programme today and for them to properly understand the consequences
you can see, can't you? I mean, we may describe them as feeble-minded, but nonetheless, it's a powerful series of images that have been beamed around the world from Afghanistan right now, and as they would see it, perhaps, of Muslim armies vanquishing the Western superpower. You can see how that forms part of a narrative that they really want to subscribe to.
I totally agree, Colin, but that's the point I'm talking about in terms of their feeble-mindedness. It's the fact that they can't separate what they see from the intellectual activity that's actually happening in the real world of politics. And what we saw in 2017 and the prelude to that across Europe and subsequently is a cohort of about 20 to 30,000 residual subjects of interest in the UK who are people that have come to the attention of the security services, but not reached a threshold that would allow us to intervene and either monitor them actively or prosecute them ideally. And it was from that group that many of the attacks emerged in that awful summer of 2017. And a lot of those people were radicalized by what they saw going on around the world. And that's what I mean by it being the short-term threat of those sorts of people who are weak of mind, quite frankly, being inspired to go and do something. I think you then have a medium-term threat, which is possibly, the retaliation from the right wing. We saw a bit of that emerge in 2017. And of course, the right wing are somewhat disparate. We don't really always understand what it is they're arguing for. We just seem to hate everybody. But with an influx of migration from Afghanistan, possibly some military elements inside the right wing, resentful of what's happened, possibly we may then see right-wing attacks emerging as well. What's for certain is the security service, MI5, through the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, will be currently actively looking at the UK threat level. The UK threat level sits at substantial at the moment, which means an attack is likely. It can go up to severe and beyond, meaning an attack is highly likely. Across 2017, we sat at highly likely, and we had those attacks happen.
Nick Aldworth, really appreciate your expertise. Thanks a lot.